If you're anything like me, you'll find handling forms in React kind of a pain, to where you have to set up various slices of state, and then you have to manage those inputs and handle the submit function and perform validation, and it can really just be a pain. And this is where external solutions come in. And one solution that's very popular that I've used and have kind of enjoyed the experience of using is React Hook Form. So today's video is going to be kind of like a crash course on some fundamentals to kind of get you up and running with React Hook Form. So as you can see here at their docs, reacthookform.com, it is a performant, flexible, and extensible forms with easy to use validation. And I definitely agree with that. I think this is very easy to use. It's easy to pick up, and you can perform validation in a very kind of easy way. And here it goes on to say, I'm not going to go into too much depth of all these, but it basically says it has a good developer experience. It follows HTML standards. It's a super lightweight package, so it's not going to have a ton of dependencies, and it's not going to like weigh down your application and cause you to ship a ton more code. It's quite performant as it minimizes the number of re-renders and validation computation. It's easy adoptable. It has a good kind of user experience as well, so on and so forth. So you can read through the docs here if you want to learn more about some of the kind of benefits and highlights of React Hook Form. But the TLDR is that it's a very common library to use. It has a good kind of documentation at their website here. As you can see, like this is already pretty good user experience, which is generally a good sign when using kind of external applications. And it's generally a pretty dang good package. So today we're going to go over some fundamentals. And to do this, we're going to build our own kind of application or demo application here. We're going to use Next.js, but this is not Next.js specific. Anytime you're using React, this is going to be relevant to you. So we're going to just create, like I said, a demo application here. So I'm going to run in my terminal here within VS Code, npx create-next-app at latest. And I'll make sure to link this GitHub project in the description below as well. But we're just going to call this React Forms. We're not going to use TypeScript, no ESLint. We are going to use Tailwind. I am going to add just a few styles here so it doesn't look completely gross, but we're not going to focus on CSS. So, you can do what you want there. We're not going to use the SRC. We are going to use the app router, and we're not going to customize the default import alias here. So with that, it's going to create this project, and then I'm going to go File, Open, and then open this within VS Code. So I've opened this new project here, and in Next.js, we're basically going to get this app directory, and it's going to give us this default template page. And then if we open the terminal again and I run npm run dev, it's going to start our development server on localhost 3000 here. I'm going to open a new terminal here as well, because we are going to need to install React Hook Form here in a sec. But if I come back and I go to localhost 3000 and I refresh my page here, you should see this kind of default Next.js page here that they kind of give us for free. So the first React Hook Form concept that we're going to go over is registration, or registering your inputs. So we're going to go ahead within the app directory here. I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to just call this register. And then within my register folder, I'm going to create a new page.jsx file within it. Now, if you're not super familiar with Next.js, when you create a page.js or JSX file within a folder that's within your app router, that automatically creates a public route. So by creating this page.js file within this register folder, I just created a route at /register within my application. So whatever I return from this page.js file is what we're going to see at the /register page. If that's not super clear, it's probably not a big deal for this tutorial, as we're going to focus on React Hook Form. And speaking of React Hook Form, we are going to npm install React-Hook-Form, and then we are going to clear this. So at the top of the file, we're going to make this a client component. So just put use client at the top of the file. This is a Next.js specific thing. It just makes this a client component so we can use our forms as we want here. But we are going to export a default function called register. Now, what we're going to do here is we're going to return a form, but with a React hook form, we need to register every one of our inputs that we use within our form so we can actually use that data of our form. And if we don't register those inputs, then React hook form doesn't really know about that input. So what we can do is we can say const register is equal the return value of calling use form. And we're going to import that from React hook form. And then from here, we're going to return a form element here in which we're going to have the on submit is going to equal, well, we need to kind of handle the submit. And with React hook form, they kind of give us also a handle submit function. So when you call the use form hook from React hook form, you get a register function as well as a handle submit function that allows you to register the inputs that you use within your form with React hook form. So React hook form knows about those inputs. And it also gives you a handle submit function so you can handle submit. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a function called on submit. It's going to accept the data of our form, and it's just going to cancel that log, that data. Now, how do we call our on submit function with React hook form? Well, for our on submit here, we can just call the handle submit from React hook form, and then we need to pass our on submit function to it. So we'll pass in our on submit function to handle submit. Right here within our on submit, we call the handle submit function from React hook form with whatever function that we want to use passed into it. So we need to pass our on submit function into the handle submit function, and we are calling this right within the on submit of the form. It is kind of standard within React hook form. And now we're just going to create a couple of different inputs. We're going to create an input here, and we aren't going to do type text, but we are going to open up a pair of curly braces here, and we're going to do ... and then call the register function. And then we need to pass in the name of our input. So for this input, I'm going to call it first name. So this is giving our input a name. And we are using the first argument of the register function to register this input within React hook form. Now, calling the register function, it returns some values, and we're basically just using the spread operator to spread the return value of the register function into this input here. And then we'll add some classes in a second, but we'll just kind of set up the inputs here to start. And then we're also going to do a select. And for this select input, we're not going to give it a name and ID, but we are going to register it. So we're going to do the same thing, ... register. And then we're going to just call this gender. And then within our select, we're going to have some different options. So this option, we will do female, and then we will do female here. I will do option shift down arrow 2 more times, and then we will do male as an option and male. And then we'll also do other, and then, whoops, I'll change this to other. And then the very last thing that we're going to do is a submit. So we are going to do another input here, and it is going to be of type submit. So this is going to set up our form. And then if we come back to our Next.js application and I go to / register, you're going to see a very disgusting looking form. So I'm now going to copy and paste my Tailwind CSS styles. If you want to do the same and you're using Tailwind, go ahead and do so. If you're not using Tailwind, then you can probably get the gist of just not styling this. It's probably fine. Or you could add just, ask ChatGPT to style yours with inline styles or something, and you're going to be able to see what we're doing here. But I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste my Tailwind CSS styles in here. You can do so as well from my GitHub application in the register file. But I'm going to go ahead and paste these in here. So nothing else changed with our logic. We're still registering our application, calling handle submit here, and all that good stuff. But now if we come back, we see it looks a lot less gross. So if I inspect and I open my console, we see that we have this form here. I'm going to put my name as my first name. I'm a male. I'm going to do submit. And then we see the data we have is first name, Ryan, gender, male. And if we come back, that matches up with the inputs we registered with first name as well as gender. But now if I forget to register this input, React hook form basically doesn't know about it anymore. So now if I do Ryan again, and I do male, and I refresh my page, which is what cleared my console here, and then I click submit, what you're going to see is I just have gender as male because I didn't register my first name input here. But if I put that back and I make sure to register it, and I refresh my page here, and then I do Ryan, male, and then look at my data here again, we see first name Ryan, gender is male. So you can imagine that this on submit here, this is where you could like save some data in your database and you could perform like some other logic here, but like that is like step one here, registering your inputs with React hook form. So it basically knows about this data here that is passed to your on submit function. All right, so step one is registering your inputs to make sure that React hook form knows about the data within those inputs. But now step two, which is, one of the main benefits that I see from React hook form, like we could have done this in basic React without much of an issue, but one of the main benefits I see comes to validation. So let's create another folder here, and I'm going to call this validation. And then we're going to create a page.jsx file within this again to create a public route at /validation. Now we're going to do the same thing. We're going to make this a use client component, and we're going to import use form from React hook form. And then we're going to export a default function called validation. And then now we are going to set up our form here, but we're going to set up a form that also has a validation. So we're going to say const. We're still going to need to register our inputs. We're still going to handle our submit function. But now React hook form will also return if there are any errors from our validation. So we could show like, this input is required, or show those errors to the user. So it also returns a form state property. And then on this form state property, it's going to have an errors property within the form state object. Okay, so it returns a form state property from use form, but form state is an object that has an errors property, which gives us the validation errors. So we are then going to destructure our errors property from use form. Okay, so it returns a register property, a handle submit property that we're both destructuring right here. And then it returns a form state property, which is an object that has an error, and it's actually errors, plural. It has an errors property on the form state object, returned from use form. And then here we can do another function on submit, and it has our data, and then it just console logs our data here. But now let's return our form in which we are going to make our on submit like we did previously. So our on submit is going to equal calling handle submit, calling that function, and then passing in our on submit. And then below this, we're going to do a wrapper div, mostly for styling purposes here. And we're going to do an input in which for this input now, we're going to register this input, but we also want to register it with validation. So we're going to pass in, kind of make this JavaScript laid right now. But what we're going to do is do ... register we're going to call this, and this is just going to be a first name input as well. But then here, as a second argument to the register function, we're going to pass an object. And these are options that we're passing to this input as we register it. So we're going to pass in an object for validation, in which we're going to say required is first name is required. So we're going to make this a required input in which the error, if they don't fill this input in, they're going to see an error message of first name is required. And then we're also going to set a max length. So max length. And then this is going to be an object in which the value is going to be 20. And then the message is going to be first name cannot exceed 20 characters. So we're registering this input, and then we're adding a couple of validation rules. So we're making this a required property, and we're also making sure that it can only be maximum length of 20. And if it's above 20, we're going to show the user a message of cannot exceed 20 characters. So for these validation rules, let's go over the supported validation list. So supported validation list. So these are all the validation rules that you can have. So you could have required, whether the input is required or not for the user to fill in. You could have min, you could have max, you could have min length, you could have max length, you can have pattern. So like a regex pattern, it has to match a certain pattern. And then you could also have a validate property. So those are kind of the supported validation list. You can definitely go to React hook form and see these as well. Most of these are pretty self-explanatory though. So now below this input here, we are also going to add, so we added our register here, but we also want to add a placeholder here in which we're just going to say first name. And then below this input, what we want to do is we want to say, so open up curly braces to enter JavaScript lane because we're going to do a conditional. We're going to check errors dot first name. If that is true, then we want to return a span that basically has the errors dot first name dot message. So basically what I'm saying is if there's an error here for our first name field, then display that message. So if this validation doesn't pass, this errors property from useForm on the first name property of the errors object, since we named this first name, we're going to display the message if there is an error on the first name property of this errors object. So that is how you can display errors or validation errors from useForm. Whatever name that you register is going to exist on this errors object. If there is a first name property on this errors object, that means there is some sort of validation error. And then you can use the .message property to display the message. And then below this div, we'll do another input here in which we'll do a div, we'll do a input, and then we will do the same thing here to where we're now going to register register. But this one is going to be last name. And then as a second argument, we're going to add some validation here. So we're going to do a pattern that it can only be letters. So let's do a pattern. And then this is going to be a regex where it's going to be an object that has a value property. And then this is where we're going to pass in a regex. Now, I have already written out a regex, so you could definitely just copy and paste this regex that I have here. But now as a message here, we're going to say that the last name must contain only letters. And then below registering this input, we can also say that the placeholder is last name. And then we want to do the very same thing that we did above here, but instead of errors.firstName, well, let's copy this, paste it here. We'll do errors.lastName. And you can see I'm repeating myself a little bit here with this kind of logic. So we could create another React component called like validation error and just pass it like the property name and have it return like a span or something like that. That would be definitely appropriate in this situation. We're not going to for the sake of just focus on React hook form, but that would also be very reasonable to do. But let's add one more input here in which the type is actually going to equal number. And then we are going to register this one as well. So open up curly braces and register. We're going to call it and we're going to say age. And then as a second argument, this is where we're going to pass in our validation rules. So we're going to pass in a min, which is going to be an object that has a value, and it's going to be 18. And then the message is going to read, you must be at least 18 years old. And then let's also do a comma and a max value, which is going to be 99. And then we will say the message is age must be less than 100. And then below our register here, we will add a placeholder called age. And then we want to do the same thing to display the errors here. So below this input, we will do errors dot instead of last name, it'll be errors dot age. And then we also need to do errors dot age here, and this should be errors dot last name. All of that should match up. And then the very final thing is below this last div, we will add an input that will be of type submit. All right, so that sets all of our inputs up here. To make sure I didn't do anything wrong here, let's come back. Let's go to /validation. And we see that we have our inputs here, but let's make this look a little bit better. So I'm going to copy and paste my Tailwind CSS. You can do whatever you did before as well, copy and paste Tailwind as well, or just ask ChatGPT to style this a little bit better for you. But what I'm going to do is paste in the styles I've already created for this. All of the logic should be the same here to where we register it with a second argument that provides our validation rules. But now if I come back, we see it looks much, much better here. So for the first name here, if I don't add a first name and I try to submit this, I see first name is required. But now if I type in a first name, you see that gets rid of the error. But if I make it super long, it says first name cannot exceed 20 characters. So it looks like our validation rules for our first name, required, and max length are working correctly. But now let's check our last name. So contain letters only. So let's just do Ryan. And there's a last name. Let's do some numbers, and you see must contain letters only. So let's do my last name. And for age, let's do 17. Well, must be at least 18 years old. So let's do 18. That's fine. Let's do 100. Must be less than 100. Let's do 26. And then if we submit it, we should see all of our data in here. So as you can see, that was a really pretty easy way to kind of set up validation here, to where we basically just use the errors property on the form state property of the use form return value to display any errors that occur. And we just add our validation here as a second argument to our register function, and everything works pretty easy out of the box here. And you can see that we've added min and max values. We've used a different pattern here, required, max length, and we covered most of, honestly, the validation rules that you're probably going to use in your actual applications here. So this is one of my favorite kind of aspects of React hook form, how easy they make validation here. But now as one last thing to show you with React hook form, it's integrating controlled components of kind of external libraries. So as you can see here, we're not like controlling these inputs. We're not like sitting here and saying, const first name, comma, set first name is equal to use state. Like we're not setting all those inputs up with slices of state. But sometimes you might want to have a controlled input. And then also some external libraries like Material UI or different UI libraries might kind of require you to use controlled inputs for how those libraries are set up. So how can you use React hook form with controlled inputs? Well, let's go ahead and create another folder within our app directory called controlled. Then we'll create a page.jsx file. Within this directory, we will make this a use client component. But now let's go ahead and install the Material UI library. So what we're going to do is npm install at MUI/material at emotion/react and at emotion/styled. So install those libraries here. And then we're just going to do a very basic example of using controlled inputs. So let's export a default function controlled, and then we can say const handle submit as well as control is equal to use form. And we need to make sure to import use form from React hook form. So use form will also return a control property that allows you to basically use controlled components. So we'll see how this works here. So we're going to we'll return a wrapper div here, and then we'll do a form in which it will also have a on submit is equal to handle submit, and we should also just do a function on submit accepts data, and then it's just going to console.log that data like we've been doing. And then for the handle submit, we need to make sure to call our on submit function. And then within this form, we're going to return a controller component. So we're going to do a controller component, but we need to import that from React hook form. So we're going to import controller, which is basically a component that they give us for free that allows us to do a controlled component. So we're going to import controller here, and we can have this be self-closing like so. Now for this controller component, we will give it a name, and we'll just give this like React text field. And then we'll give it a control property, which is equal to our control property returned from use form. And I'll explain all this in a second. And then we will give it a render function. And this is where we can render a Material UI component here, which basically makes this a controlled component. We're going to pass in a function to the render property, and we're going to destructure field. And then we are going to basically return a text field from Material UI, making sure you import that from at MUI/material. And then what we need to do here is within this text field component, well, we need to pass it in our value of this component. However, that is going to be on this field property here that we're destructuring from this render that we're passing to the controller component from React hook form. So we could do ... field, which is going to pass it in all the kind of values that it needs for this text field for Material UI to work. And for the label, we can just do React text field. And then for the variant, we will do outlined. And then below this component, we will just do a button, and we'll actually do a button for Material UI here. So we'll do capital button, and then we need to make sure to import that from material UI. And then this button is going to be of type submit. The variant, and this is kind of more material UI focused, it's just going to be contained. And the color is going to be primary. And we'll just say that this reads as submit. So what we've done here is we wanted to use a material UI component, but material UI wants us to make this a controlled component here, or at least we want to implement as a controlled component. So the way that we can use controlled components with React Hook Form is using the controller component, which is basically a wrapper around inputs that you want to be a controlled input. So we use this controller component and we give it a name. We give it a control prop that is attached to our form that we get returned from our use form hook. So you pass in control is equal to control. And then here you give it a render prop in which you can render the component that you want to be controlled. So we're rendering this text field component, passing it the field parameter that is within our function here that we pass into our render property. And then you spread that field into the props of your controlled component that you want here, a text field in our case. And then that basically allows you to have a controlled component here. Now I'm going to add some styles here like I always have. You can do whatever you've kind of done previously. All the logic is going to be the same. I'm just adding in some styles here. And then let me close this so you can see the rest of this page. And then I also realized that I did a little bit differently of a function here. So for this handle submit, let's make sure that we are indeed passing in our on submit like we were before. I think that's the only thing I changed in the project that I made as just a demo project before this. But now if we come back and I go to what I call this controlled, we see a React text field here. And this basically makes it a controlled component. So if I type in here, I click submit, we see our data as React text field, and we see our value here like normal. But the only difference here is we are using a material UI controlled component here as our text field. So that is a basic kind of crash course and introduction on React Hook Form. We covered using controlled components, registering your components, as well as validating all of your inputs within React Hook Form. So hopefully you learned a bunch about React Hook Form in this video. And I think, just with this basic kind of introduction / crash course here, we covered basically everything you need to start using React Hook Form within your React applications. So thanks for tuning into this, and I'll see you in that next one.